All right, so hi everyone. It's great to and a bit impressive to see that many people joining, still joining apparently the presentation today. Um, so as Adam said, I joined HCSS a few months ago, and I've been doing my PhD at Oxford for a few years now, where I focus on foreign election interference, that more specifically the ones that are cyber enabled. And so it's a timely topic. We just had elections in Brazil, for instance. Apparently, Lula got elected. So it's very, very, very good and timely topic to talk about. What I would like to go through today is to give you a few examples of what we're talking about. I'll give you a little bit of historical background to take a little bit of perspective on the events and show you that election interference is not something new at all, but the ways to do it are mostly new, some of them at least. Then I'll present my arguments for why we need a new concept and why the kind of interference we are witnessing these days is significantly different than what we've seen in the past. I will go through the literature review, the main debates in the literature in terms of concepts of foreign election interference, and then we'll present you the concept as a whole. So it's mostly a kind of an introductory lecture to show you what we're talking about, what are the main dimensions of the problem, and then to put things a little bit more into perspective, I will present you the French strategy, French cybersecurity strategy, and how foreign election interference and countering that kind of interference is taken into account by the French cybersecurity strategy. All right, so let's start. So you can see on your screen three instances of elections, and specifically of elections that have suffered foreign interference, allegedly in some of them or confirmed in some others. You can see at the bottom, it should be bottom left of your screen, the American election in 2016, in the center, the French election a few months later in 2017, top right, the Brexit campaign in the UK. Now, what do these three elections or electoral processes, because the last one is a referendum, what do they have in common? Well, they have suffered significant election interference from foreign actors, some more significant than others, and using different techniques. So I will go through some of them. To give you an example of recent instances of interference and the kind of tools and procedures that foreign adversaries can use against a democracy. So the American example is probably the most well-known among you. The several Russian threat actors, so Russian hackers in a sense, sponsored by the Russian government, all part of a formal government organization, hacked through the network of the Democratic National Committee. They downloaded some internal emails and then released them into the public sphere through WikiLeaks. These emails were damaging to the Democratic Party in general and for Hillary Clinton as well. In addition to this, the American election suffered interference with more social media-oriented interference with a troll farm, the Internet Research Agency, which is based in Russia as well, which manipulated the debate online and tried to really oppose different parts of society, of the American society, against each other. Won't go into too much details, but happy to talk about it later if you wish. In the So that was in, at the end of, it started in the operation started in 2015 all the way until the election in 2016. A few months later in France, that was the election took place in April 2017. So France experienced something a little bit similar, but having seen what happened in the US just 6 months earlier, they were a little bit more prepared. What happened is that um, the Russians tried to again hack through the party here of the party of Emmanuel Macron, En Marche, and try to find and steal some sensitive documents that could be embarrassing or would damage the
Pardon,
candidacy.
Pardon to interrupt, Arthur.
Yeah.
Just a public service announcement to the people raising their hands in the chat. We disabled the chat for lectures, but in the last 5 minutes, we will open the chat where you can ask your questions from Arthur and our expert lecturers in general. Sorry to interrupt, Arthur.
No worries, no worries. That's good to know. So we'll have 5 minutes for questions at the end. Is that right? Or
that is correct, indeed.
All right, this is good to keep in mind. Thank you. So keep your questions for the end, please. Write them down maybe somewhere, and then we can go through them at the end if we have enough time. So yeah, the hacking of the Macron campaign was not very successful overall. The Russians didn't find anything very special, so they tried to fabricate some damaging information, some damaging material that didn't really work. Partly because the French electoral system is quite different from the American one, and the Russians released the documents too late. Also because the government was more prepared than the American government in that case. Again, not going to dwell on it too much, but if you have questions on this, please write that down, and we can talk about that later. Now on the Brexit campaign, that one is a little bit different from the two previous. Again, Russian interference in that case expressed itself through two things: social media, Twitter and Facebook mostly, and also through official and unofficial state news agencies. One of them being Russia Today, or as we know it now, RT, but also others such as Sputnik. You may have heard of them. And so what happened in the UK is that these news outlets and on social media pushed a significantly pro-Brexit narrative. They kind of skewed the debate towards the pro-Brexit side. They shared a very small amount I mean, they shared a number of neutral and small number of pro-Remain narratives, but these were very small. And overall, the Russians pushed for a pro Brexit narrative. How much did that affect voters? In all three cases, it's quite hard to assess. It's quite hard to do, but on social media, at least, we can measure what we call engagement, and in the UK case, in particular, the Russian outlets on social media had more engagement and reached out to more people than the two official Brexit campaigns combined. They were in the UK. There were two actually coordinating Brexit campaigns, pro-Brexit campaigns. not just one. And the Russian influence had more engagement than these two ones combined. So it's quite significant in all cases, but also in the Brexit case. So this is what kind of a quick overview. Now, what do they have in common? Not only they suffered interference, but they suffered interference that were cyber-enabled, in the sense that either information systems were used to get, in that case, the US and France potentially damaging information, and then release it to damage the candidacy of these people, or social media was used to push the debate one side or another. Here we go. There we go. So now that you've seen these recent contemporary instances, let's take a step back and see what we've seen in the past, and how we can define foreign interference. Foreign interference, as I said earlier, isn't something new. It's something that's been going on probably as far as there's been elections, so quite a long time. And the traditional form can be defined as follow: the intervention of a foreign power into the electoral ecosystem of a country. For what purpose? To influence its political environment, and that can be a lot of things, up to, of course, the election results. Right. First things to unpack here: the electoral ecosystem and the political environment. What is that electoral ecosystem? It's the process, the political and legal process for the election to take place. It's the infrastructure, so either voting machines for the countries that use them, but also sometimes, just the physical voting booth. It's the political and the regulatory environments, and obviously public opinion, which is in part shaped through the media. So there's a lot of things that a foreign power can try to influence. The attack surface, as we say in cybersecurity, is quite wide. Now, what's the aim? The aim is to influence the political environment. So that can mean to, create divisions into the target society. That can be pushing a specific agenda. That can be trying to damage a specific candidacy, or that can be just to try to delegitimize the election altogether without supporting anyone. And now you can see on your screen 3 different examples of interference. The French, for instance, were quite opposed to the re-election of George Washington in 1796. There is some exchange of letters there. It's quite covered by the historians. It's a fascinating story if you have time to dig into it. I picked that old example to show you that this is not new. During the Cold War, the early Cold War in Italy in 1948, the Americans spread some propaganda, anti-communist propaganda disguised as legitimate material, and then in 1877, the Germans, Bismarck, supported Leon Gambetta's re-election secretly. So without, again, going into too much details, you can see that these things have happened for a long time. They're not new. And we have some kind of a working definition for these events. But this doesn't really cover the new forms that we've just discussed. And so my argument here is that the developments of technology, information technology, social media, among other things, have really changed 2 things: the scale and the nature of interference, and its powers of political disruption. And so this is the first argument. And the second subset of the argument is that this means that we need a new concept, or we need a new definition for it. This is what I call cyber-enabled foreign election interference. And again, new subset of the argument here is that it is quantitatively and qualitatively different from traditional interference. So we're going to unpack this a little bit now. Now, when we talk about interference that is cyber-enabled, there is, I mean, traditional or cyber, there is a few debates to get into. And there's many, but I've picked 4 because I think these are the most important ones, and you have the references in the literature if you want to dig deeper into these. These are either scientific journal articles or scientific books. The first, a conceptual debate, is further influence versus direct manipulation. And that is a distinction that is valid on cyber or traditional interference. The question here is, do we focus on interference that influences how voters think and vote? And so that means through media, social media, propaganda, you're going to promote a specific narrative or try to damage a candidate to indirectly change how people vote? Or are you also looking at direct ballot manipulation? Are you also looking at whether it hacks or by hand physically, someone altering the ballots, removing the ballots, adding fake ballots, as we see in some countries, one of them being Russia, regularly? This is an important distinction because this is going to change the scope of your study. The second very important conceptual debate is if you look at covert actions only, or if you take into account overt actions. To make things clear, covert versus overt, the distinction is that covert actions are not meant to be known. They are secret. Overt actions are in the public light. And that changes quite a lot because covert actions are obviously, usually if they're covered, it's because they're illegal or because they would be very damaging to your bilateral relationship as a foreign state. Overt actions are more because they're in the public sphere, they are more in the sphere of potentially public diplomacy. Overt action, for instance, would be for an official, so someone acting in an official capacity of the state, commenting on an election going on, saying, yes, this candidate in our neighboring country is not great. His program would damage the environment, that would affect us as well. He's not a good candidate. That would be an overt interference. It's not necessarily illegal, it's probably not illegal, but it could be damaging from a diplomatic point of view. And that is still a form of interference. But that may not be the kind of interference you're most interested in. Usually the covert interference is more damaging and more blatant. The third distinction we have to make is whether we focus only on certain types of votes or all types of votes. Again, not going into a course on democracy here, but you can choose to focus on votes of succession. So usually when an election is about a person, when the program is personified by someone, these are leadership elections, presidential elections, parliamentary elections typically are votes of succession. Or you can also extend your scope to all kinds of democratic processes, And the Brexit referendum, for instance, is not a vote of succession, but is a very important democratic process, something that really changed the life of millions of people and for generations, right? So there is some sense into limiting the scope of your research or of your concept, but be mindful of this as well. And then the fourth conceptual debate is also super important, and that's about if you focus only on process interference or into candidate interference, and that has more to do with the um, the purpose of the interference. Um, the distinction is quite easy. The process interference only seeks to delegitimize the election itself. Um, so that can be done in a myriad of ways. But this usually doesn't try to support or damage a specific candidate. You just want to make a mess, basically. And then the candidate interference is much more, let's say, purposeful, targeted, because you have a clear agenda of supporting one side, or at least negatively or positively, so supporting one side or damaging another. Um, so these are things you need to keep in mind when you conceptualize something, or when you design a research, or even a newspaper article or something like this. When you talk about these things, these are the some of the dimensions of the problem we need to think about. Now, now that we've said all that, we've gone through the you know the burden of conceptualizing a little bit. We can start contrasting these new forms of interference with the old ones. What do these new forms of interference bring to the table that we didn't see before? Well, the first big difference is that cyber interference can reach people with much less filter than before. And by filter, I mean, I don't mean the social media filter, I mean an editorial filter. Beforehand, before social media, people would get their information through their friends and families or through the newspapers, typically. What this meant is that there was some kind of editorial filter into how the news was presented. So yes, of course, there was some political coloring of the newspapers. You must be aware that newspapers often have some political leaning to the right, to the left, more progressive, more conservatives, but it was, it wasn't hidden. It was very clear. You had an editor-in-chief. It was very transparent, or to some extent transparent. What kind of information you were getting what kind of sources you were getting your information from. With social media, it's very different. There is a lot of filters, but they are not the same, or they're much less transparent. When you scroll through your timeline, whether it's on Twitter and Facebook or even on Instagram or TikTok, the political ads or the political content that you receive, whether it's presented as such or in a dubious way, it's not very clear often who pushes that narrative to you. And when you enter a conversation, it's also not clear how the conversation is steered, either by the platform's algorithm or by moderation. The second difference is that the content in a way that is going to influence you, the informational content, can be much more tailor-made for your specific profile. That is how social media platforms make a living, is by profiling you, right? We know your approximate age, your gender, your social class. We know your interests through things you like, you share, the topics you engage with. So platforms and advertisers have a pretty clear idea of who they are pushing their ads to. And this is the same for states that seek to influence your elections. Um, they kind of know where, in which communities they want, what content they want to push to what community, and they are able to do this now. This is much more powerful than what you could do through newspaper advertisements. Um, and then the last point is the fact that new forms of interference are adaptable at very short notice. Um, you don't need to design a whole propaganda campaign that's going to take weeks, or you don't even need to wait the next newspaper to push some content. You can push, you can write something down quickly, even get a designer to do a little poster in a couple hours, and you can push that on social media to the exact community you want with the exact um, narrative that you want. And that is very powerful potentially. What does that mean? The big implication is that it is easier for a foreign interferer to seize a political window of opportunity. Um, you can see on the right how it's a poster. It's a sensitization campaign by the American Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, where they show you how an influence campaign can start from something very, very small, and then the different steps through which it goes into becoming mainstream and taking over the political conversation. And I'm not going to go into it right now, but you can see that these steps actually don't take a lot of time. With social media, you can go through these steps maybe in a few hours, maybe 24 hours, at most a few days. It depends. It's very contextual. But you can take something very sometimes stupid and insignificant, and then unravel it and turn it into something massive politically that is going to go into from the fringes of the discussion into the center of the political discussion. And that is something that really was not possible. I mean, not as fast before. And yeah, what that means is that often these interference campaigns or these influence campaigns rely on what we call useful idiots. And a more scientific term would be domestic enablers. They are um, relays of the foreign propaganda, but that are uh, part of your domestic political environment or mediatic environment. In the case of the DNC leaks in 2016 in the US, it's Trump asking for Clinton's emails to be released. That definitely plays into the narratives that the Russians wanted to push. And then often what you see also is that these interference attempts they seek to create or amplify divisions within the polity, within the society. So in the US case, it was Democrats against Republicans, obviously, but it was also Clinton versus Sanders, so trying to create division within the Democratic Party. In the UK, obviously, it was Brexiters versus Remainers. In France, it was European liberals versus protectionists. And often this is this duality of progressives versus protectionist conservatives that it's often this duality, this dual opposition that we see that foreign powers try to amplify. So what we have established so far is that cyber-enabled foreign election interference is more potent. It is cheaper to do. It can scale to a very, very wide extent. It is accessible. You don't need to be a propaganda expert now. I could even go on the dark web and hire someone to do an influence operation on my behalf. Just need a bit of money and access. If you have $200,000, $200,000, you can go to someone and say, yes, I want to help you. I want you to help me um, create a protest in the streets of London, New York, or Caracas, right? This is influence or interference as a service. This is a subset of cybercrime as a service in general. This happens for ransomware, for instance, and a lot of other things. But what that means is that you don't need to have state capabilities to do this anymore, or you don't need to be a very powerful state to be able to do this anymore. Don't need to dedicate millions of dollars of pounds of or euros into your secret agencies. You can just pay someone on the dark web to do it for you. So this means that the range of actors that can do this is much wider than before. Now, let's take a bit of a breather, take a step back, and think about everything we've seen so far. And let's try to come up with a definition that encompasses everything that we've talked about for the past 30 minutes. You can come up with your own definition, obviously, and there will be a lot of competing definitions because everyone has a little different angle and view on things. But this is how I define and conceptualize cyber-enabled foreign electoral interference. For me, it is the intervention of a foreign power, again, into the electoral ecosystem of a country. We've gone through what is the electoral ecosystem. But for me, there's three objectives: to do three different things. They're not mutually exclusive. They can be done in parallel, or it could be just one. The first one is to polarize society. Second one is to undermine trust in democracy, the electoral process in general, but democracy as a whole, and potentially influence election results if that's one of your objectives as well. How do you do this? In the case of cyber-enabled interference, by leveraging online mass communications characteristics of what we've just seen: direct access to people with little editorial filter, tailored content to your audience, and reactive engagement to be able to seize the domestic political window of opportunity. This is how we can conceptualize a new phenomenon. And you can do this with whatever you study. This is a good example of how you can do this. Now, I'm personally very visual in the way I do things. I like graphs. I like tables, and so when I do this kind of work, I like to put it into a visual form. And here you can find all the different dimensions of what we've talked about. So I won't go through it again, but it's a good reminder that often a image is worth, at least 1,000 words. But here you find again the main event of interest, the three potential goals, and then the different tools that an interferer has at its disposal. I didn't go really into them because they are quite basic, but I've mentioned them along the presentation. Direct ballot manipulation is the most blatant and direct one, but the indirect ones are trolling online, disinformation in all its ways, and then doxing, which is what I've shown you in the American and French examples, which is a form of hack and leak of damaging information. And then underneath, you have social media platforms that have these characteristics that allow an interferer to seize the political window of opportunity. So if we had to summarize the past half hour, this would be this one graph. Now, because I realize I don't have a lot of time left, I'm going to go through the different strategies. What strategy can we develop against these new forms of threat? To do so, I'm going to take the example of France because it's the one I know better. But you can do this with a lot of different countries, and a lot of different countries have adopted counter-interference strategies. Again, not going to go through the whole history of French cybersecurity policies, but in a nutshell, France started conceptualizing its cybersecurity from 2017 onwards. I mean, with the first document in 2015, but it really started to gain political traction in 2017 with a national cyber defense strategy, a push for norms on the international level, and then more recently, since 2019, more detailed military doctrines in terms of how the state can use military means to defend itself, attack other people, and also use influence to defend its armed forces. I don't think these documents are available in English, not all of them, but you can easily translate them online. Now, the first national strategy for cyber defense is from 2018, and it settles 7 principles, or if you want, priorities. And you can see that security of information systems is the first priority. The second one shows you that the French have a policy of active discouragement, and we'll get into it more into details because that's the interesting bit. And then you have references to digital sovereignty, judicial response, a safe Europe, and then the international governance of cyberspace. And so in 2018, President Macron, who had just experienced some forms of interference into his election, presented the Paris principles for trust and security, Paris Call, sorry, for trust and security in cyberspace. One of these big principles being non-interference into democratic processes, which mirrors the United Nations Charter. Again, a number of principles focus on protection of the individuals, the infrastructure, and you can see that the third point is electoral processes. You have other ones, obviously, we're not going to go into them because they're out of scope for today. But you can see that electoral processes is one of the 9 principles, and it's the third one. So again, you can see that first the state started with, national strategies that encompass everything. They're quite holistic, and they take a whole of government approach to cybersecurity. And then as the response and the policies mature, the state moves on to more nitty-gritty details of military doctrines. And parallel, push for international norms. Now, again, I love graphs. So here's another one. And this is how I would summarize the French strategy on cyber defense, and that also includes election interference potentially. The normative pillar is promotion of norms against meddling into democratic process, and it relies into the Paris Accord and UN processes. The second step of the pyramid is de-escalation in terms of in case of crisis. So you're going to try to engage directly with your opponent. In some cases, if it goes very bad, the state, through the EU or through its own agencies, ministries, will make a strategic attribution of the attack it has suffered from. And then the tip of the spear, if you wish, is the deterrence or discouragement pillar, and it's the more offensive side, where the French armed forces can neutralize basically the digital infrastructure of their opponent. And then, supporting that pyramid are two things. European strategic autonomy, I mean, national, but usually part of the European strategic autonomy, because you need to have the ability to respond. And that means you need to have the capabilities, the material capabilities, but also the legal capabilities to respond. And then, and that's specific to France, that's not always the case, is a institutional separation between offensive and defensive function. But again, not really the topic of the focus of that of the talk today. So I'm not going to get into it, and I see them running out of time. So I'm not going to go into this. This is how the French response within the state goes. Again, happy to go into details into that for the questions. But yeah, this is a good summary here. I will stop there with this slide. This shows you the military and civilian organization of the French state in terms of so cyber defense. And you can see that the civilian agency on what should be the right side of your screen, ANSI, handles the defense of critical infrastructure in the state. And then the military organizations either defend themselves or perform offensive operations to deter cyber attacks. Again, with an overarching principle of subsidiarity. So the lower levels respond first, and then the response of the state escalates as the attack grows in importance. Again, not the main focus of today's presentation, but happy to go into details if you wish. Yes. So now, I just wanted to give you some conceptual keys to analyze state policy, whether it's a foreign policy or it's any kind of policy, really. This is taken out of a very famous book by Allison and Zelikov on the Cuban Missile Crisis. But basically, you can use these conceptual keys to analyze your state's policy, and then try to understand, make sense of it, right? The first level focuses on individuals and processes. The middle one focuses on organizations, the parameters, their missions, their cultures. And then the top one really looks at the state as a rational black box with, strategic goals, the national interest, and, as a very rational actor. So yeah, again, running out of time here, so not going to go into details here, but happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So yeah, I know it's a bit rushed towards the end, as often we run out of time at the end. So happy to talk about any of these things further. Please share your questions in the comments section, and then happy to chat. And Adam, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Arthur. I believe we all learned a great deal about the various cyber dangers our democracies face today. Now, I believe we have time for 3 questions. Raise your hands in the lobby, your audience. So the first question will be from Raman D, and I will allow your microphone, and I would like to ask you to keep your question brief so that you allow Arthur to respond. You may unmute yourself.
Yeah, Arthur, this is Dr. Raman. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, there's a lot of background noise, but
Am I audible? Hello.
yes.
You are
What is
audible,
your
but
question?
there's a lot of background noise.
Yeah. Hello. My question is that electronic voting machine, is it have connection to internet facility or not? If it is not having internet facility, how the people may get attack it?
Let's try to Adam. Did you get it?
So yeah, so Arthur, the question I think which Mr. Raman is asking that many of the EVMs don't have internet connectivity. So what is the way they are attacked? I think that is the question Raman was asking.
Many what? Sorry.
EVMs, electronic voting machines. So.
Oh yeah. Well, it really depends on the country. And oh wait, am I still sharing my screen? Maybe I can stop sharing my screen. Here we go. Yeah. So electronic voting machines are quite specific to the country that you are looking at, but yes, usually they're not connected to the internet, although you have to be careful with that assumption. What we call an air-gapped system or network, something that is disconnected from the internet, can often be connected by mistake, and network segregation is a really hard thing to do. So my first answer is be careful of that assumption, because I know that researchers in the US have found that some voting machines were actually pinging on some internet networks. So there's some attack surface here. Another attack surface is the physical machine. So you can come in to vote, and then when someone is, if there's enough distraction around you, you can plug in a USB key, a USB device, drop your payload there, and I think researchers at Black Hat a few years ago were able to hack a voting machine with physical access within a few minutes, or like 15 minutes. So if you have the physical access and enough, a little bit of time, that is possible as well. And then the last point I would like to make is that we shouldn't overtly focus on the voting machines themselves. Usually when your country uses electronic voting machines, the rest of the infrastructure is also digitalized. What that means is that, so I don't know very well the Indian voting system, but the American voting system is a mess, because there's so many political layers of jurisdiction that everyone does its own thing. Very small levels of political jurisdiction mean that there's a lot of potential holes in the racket for an intruder to get in and get access to not necessarily the votes themselves, but it can be the voters' records. Right? You can mess with the postal address of the people. You can mess with their names potentially, and all of that is not going to directly change the name on the ballot. This is going to potentially create a lot of disruption on election day. and that is going to create a lot of distrust in the process in public opinion. So if your goal is just to mess around and create a lot of chaos on election day, you can also do it that way. You don't need direct access to the voting machines necessarily. If you want to push for a specific person or a specific political side, that is a different problem. Yeah.
Thank you, Arthur. Our next question will be from Ms. Ayla El-Sinha. Ayla, I'm enabling your mic. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. So my question is, could you please go a bit more into detail about what role control or propaganda centers play during the process of neutralization? And thank you in advance.
Sorry, can you repeat in the process of neutralization? I got this, but not the beginning.
Yes, so if you could please go a bit more into detail about what role control or propaganda centers play during the process of neutralization in the pyramid model you showed. Thank you.
Yes, sure. Then the pyramid scheme, yeah. Well, all right. When you are an attacker, right, an interferer, and you want to, spread some information manipulation on social networks, or you want to hack a network, you need an infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I mean a building, simply. You need a building with internet access, with a lot of servers, potentially, with a lot of computers. If you take the information manipulation side of it, you can just take the example of the Internet Research Agency in Russia, which was what people call the troll farm for the Russian government. And these people were quite organized and quite well funded. We're talking about millions of dollars worth of money, budget. And so if you are a defender, one of the things you might want to do in terms of more offensive actions, what we call potentially neutralization, is to cut down the internet access of these people. Try to mess with the configuration of their servers. That can be also in a less offensive way. It can be also reporting their fake accounts to the platforms they are on. That is one also effective strategy. So you have a wide range as a defender of more or less offensive actions you can take, and this is the command and control centers or the propaganda centers that you would want to target. And actually, we have one example of this. We know that during the midterms in 2020 in the US, US Cyber Command basically shut down the Internet Research Agency building on the day of the election. So we know that some states are able to do this. And it looks like on that day it was effective.
Thank you, Arthur. And for our third question, we would like to move on to Mr. Madanaga Venkata. I will enable your microphone and feel free to ask your question from Arthur. You may unmute yourself now.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
We can hear you.
My question is, what if the voting system goes online all over the globe? And is there any chance of attacking? And what are the ways of securing online voting system if it happens?
Sorry, can you repeat again the beginning?
What if the voting system goes online all over the globe?
Yeah.
And is there any chances of attacking from the attacker's side? And what are the ways of securing the online voting system if it happens?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I don't think, if anything, I think we're kind of seeing not a return to paper ballots, but I think we are seeing states being more prudent about digitizing further their election processes and infrastructure. France, for instance, has had um, a policy in place to stop the implementation of digital voting systems. They started in the 90s, and maybe around between 1 and 1.5 million potential voters, eligible voters, would vote on electronic voting machines in France. That's the eligible voter. It's not the people that actually vote, because unfortunately we don't have great turnouts in these days. But basically the spread of voting machines, electronic voting machines, is stopped in France. And I don't think, for instance, we're anywhere near a worldwide diffusion of this practice, for very obvious security reasons. Now, if that was to happen, which is the point you raised, if we were seeing quasi-universal diffusion of that practice, well, I think yes, it would expand the attack surface mechanically, but that would also mean that there would be more money potentially and coordination between governments on that matter. Now, the problem is that every political system is different. And in some states that are, especially the ones that are less centralized and more federalized, I think India is quite an example of a quasi-federal state, a little bit like in the US. There can be a lot of, again, problems if the election infrastructure and the cybersecurity response is handled by too many actors at too many different levels. Because if you don't have, one actor, one ministry, or one agency that decides of, the system you're going to use, how you're going to use it, the defensive measures, and the policy coordination, that is fine. If you have, dozens, it's going to create a lot of problems and delay and confusion, and vulnerabilities, just by the mere design of the political system. So I would say actually that it's a bit it's a little bit it's a bit funny, because the political systems that are probably the best for electronic voting machines are unitary systems, very centralized systems like France. But these systems are usually not in place in countries with very large populations, which tend to be federalized to some extent, just as a matter of political history. And so we end up with federal systems with a very large population, which decide, because of the very large population, to get electronic voting machines, but then they have to deal with these layers of political jurisdiction that create a lot of vulnerabilities. So yeah, that is potentially a problem.
Thank you, Arthur. We ran out of time, and we don't want to keep you for too long. Would you be happy to take one more question?
Yeah, I can do one more.
Thank you. In that case, Adhiraj, you raised your hand a while ago, so let me enable your microphone and feel free to ask your question from Arthur. You may unmute yourself. Adhiraj, are you with us?
I think there is some issue. We can try Taha, the next one.
I understand. Taha, I enabled your microphone. You may unmute yourself and ask your question. Are you with us, Taha?
Okay. I think Arthur is just trying to go on time. So it's time. I think we're done. Oh, he just unmuted himself.
Oh, yeah. Let
Yeah.
me allow his mic again.
Yeah, Taha, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
perfectly.
Again.
Yeah. So my question is regarding social media. You have stressed a lot about how social media has been used to change public opinion or tip the balance of the public opinion during a election. So how can a state or a central government or a federal government in different countries, responsibly moderate the content that has been posted on social media? And these a few days ago, the Indian government released a new internet bill, social media moderation bill related to that. It sort of looks like they are trying to control the content that's been posted, but on the other hand, there's a lot of fake news and propaganda going on also. So how can a fine line be drawn between controlling and having freedom to post what you want, or to talk about your own opinion without being taken down from the social media? Like, how can the state have a responsible uh, um, standard of operating? That is my question regarding social media.
Yeah, thanks to have a question. Very timely, because we've been talking a lot about Elon Musk taking over Twitter and firing some of the executives and having a more let's say flexible policy towards free speech. And that's a very hard problem. And there's no easy question, no easy solution. There's there's the overall problem of content moderation, right? That is one thing, and I think there's more or less the easier ones are hateful speech and these kind of things that can be also automatically flagged at least and then analyzed by humans and then moderated probably quite efficiently. The problem with information manipulation is that there's two things. You can, as an interferer, you can do two things at least. You can choose to spread fake information, and there, as a platform and as a government, to respond to this, the issue is how do you decide what is true and what is factually not true, right? Because often politics is a matter of opinion and of belief. And so it's very hard for a government to take a position because they don't want to be seen as restricting freedom of expression to the amount that is allowed by law. And sometimes going against too hard against fake information can be counterproductive. So it's a very hard position to be for government. The second thing you can do as a interferer for an interferer is, and that's even more hard to counter, is when you spread genuine information or almost genuine information, but you just support one side. You act as kind of the public relations agency of one of the candidates for free. And that has more to do with not with regulations on what is true or not, or what is hateful or not. It has more to do with the fairness of the campaigning. And often that is in the realm of the National Electoral Commission or the equivalent that you have in your country. And then again, really hard to do because how do you you need some measures for transparency, in that case. You need established processes to be able to know who is doing political advertising, who is publishing political content that is not something that is endogenous to your political discussion in the public discourse, and then what is structured, paid for by the parties or their communications agencies. That is fine, but it needs to be transparent, regulated, fair. And then you have what is what is mostly exogenous and what is coming from abroad, and that is going to unfairly affect or influence your political ecosystem and where the political discussion and debate is going. I know I'm not bringing any magic solution to the table to your question, but that's because there's none, and the issue will again depend on your local politics, your culture, in terms of how you weigh in the different values and interests. Free speech versus free speech and freedom of expression, and how you balance that with the protection of minorities, the fairness of your election. Different countries have different, they usually have the same big interest. Obviously, everyone wants, every democracy wants freedom of expression, and every genuine democracy wants to protect its minorities from hate speech or things like this. But the exact balancing between these values, where you really draw the line between one and the other, is going to depend a lot on your local laws and your local political culture. So it's really hard to design a one-size-fits-all answer and measure to this. This has to be done by public debate through mostly in parliament, obviously, but through public debate as well, because it's a very important matter. Because if you don't have fair elections, then and then the rest of your democratic system doesn't stand very firmly.
Thank you very much, Arthur. You've been very generous with your time, and I'm very grateful that all of us could learn so much about the cyber subversions against democracy that we're facing today. I would like to thank you for your time. And to our dear students, within a couple minutes, you will receive a reminder email about Mr. Ricky Rakesh's expert lecture that starts at 10 minutes past 6 IST. And I hope to see as many of you there as possible. Thank you again, Arthur, and thank you for your time.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Adam, for
Arthur.
the invitation. Thank you to everyone who organized this, everyone who took part, asked questions, listened, and then I hope that was useful and that will spark some interest in the topic and in the debates that we've touched upon today. Thank you.